The cold, methodical precision with which he would dismantle her life began not with a grand revelation, but with a single, damning line on a credit card statement. It was a silent declaration of war, etched in numbers in an exotic location, revealing a betrayal far deeper than he had ever imagined. David Albright stood rigidly in the center of his otherwise cheerful kitchen, the aroma of forgotten coffee turning stale around him. His gaze was fixated on the stark, white rectangle of paper clutched in his hand, his eyes tracing the same infuriating entry for the fifth time, each pass deepening the chilling certainty that had settled in his gut. Elysian Sands Retreat, Riviera Maya, for $1,827.42. The date was 3 weeks prior, coinciding perfectly with what his wife, Sarah, had cheerfully described as a relaxing girls' weekend at a quaint wellness center in New Haven County. A tremor, barely perceptible, ran through his fingers, yet his grip remained firm. 16 years of shared laughter, quiet evenings, and the mundane comfort of matrimony now felt like a fragile illusion, shattered by this one irrefutable truth. 16 years of being casually dismissed as boring David, or my accountant husband, had been tolerable, even predictable. But this was a transgression that tore at the very fabric of his reality, an unforgivable breach of trust that demanded a response of equal magnitude. The once inviting yellow walls, a vibrant hue Sarah had painstakingly chosen to brighten their modest home in Beacon Hill, Massachusetts, now seemed oppressing on him, their cheerful optimism a cruel mockery of his inner turmoil. He moved with deliberate slowness to the kitchen window, his eyes scanning their small, well-tended backyard. The persistent, grating bark of a neighbor's dog, usually a minor annoyance, now felt like a raw nerve exposed, exacerbating the tempest brewing beneath his composed exterior. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he navigated to Sarah's recent photo gallery. There she was, smiling brightly, posing in what she claimed was the Willow Creek Wellness Center. But the background didn't lie. The unmistakable sweep of a pristine beach, the distinctive silhouettes of palm trees swaying gently, and, most damning of all, the faint, elongated shadow of a man at the very edge of one selfie. A shadow too distinctly masculine to be part of a girl's weekend. David had always been a man of meticulous habits, a trait honed by years as a senior tax auditor for the Federal Bureau of Taxation, FBT. His profession was a constant theater of deceit. People lied to him daily, elaborately, and he had cultivated an uncanny knack for unearthing the slightest inconsistency, the most subtle misdirection. Now, with a chilling sense of irony, those finely tuned skills were not being applied to anonymous tax dodgers, but rather turned inward, dissecting the meticulously constructed facade of his own marriage, revealing a landscape of profound personal betrayal. With a measured breath, David opened his laptop, the hum of the machine a stark contrast to the quiet storm raging within him. He logged into their joint checking account, the familiar interface now a portal to a hidden world of deception. The Riviera Maya charge was not an isolated incident. A cash advance of $500, dated the very same day, stood out glaringly, followed by another expenditure at a trendy eatery called the Ocean Breeze Bistro, $287 for two people. Two people. David's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching beneath his skin. He systematically captured a screenshot of every suspicious transaction, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency, then created a new, starkly named folder on his desktop, Project S. All the incriminating images were meticulously saved within. His phone vibrated, pulling him from his digital hunt. A text from Sarah. Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. The casual, unburdened lie was a fresh sting, sharper than he had anticipated. David had never been the archetypal, jealous husband. He had never felt the urge to scrutinize her phone or question her whereabouts. His trust had been absolute, a bedrock upon which their shared life was built. Even when her friend, Michelle, had started planting insidious ideas about open marriages and exploring your options, he had remained unconcerned, confident in their bond. He typed back, his fingers steady despite the tremor in his soul. "No problem. I'll be working on some files anyway." The truth in his words was layered, a subtle deception mirroring her own. He was going to work on files, but not the kind she envisioned. David closed his laptop with a quiet click and ascended the stairs to their bedroom. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Sarah's makeup scattered casually across her vanity, her clothes from the previous evening draped artfully over a chair. But now, his perception was irrevocably altered. He noticed the expensive, unfamiliar perfume bottle he'd never seen her wear around him, its scent now vaguely cloying. There was also a delicate, new piece of lingerie, still in its shopping bag, tags attached, hinting at an intended recipient who was not him. His eyes scanned the room with an auditor's precision until they landed on her closet. Tucked away behind her collection of shoes, he found it, a small, unassuming jewelry box. Inside lay not precious baubles, but a tiny key, a key to a safe deposit box he knew nothing about, and a receipt from a mobile phone store indicating the purchase of a second device. A burner phone. David sank heavily onto the edge of their bed, the flimsy receipt trembling slightly in his hands, a stark contrast to his otherwise controlled demeanor. This wasn't merely an affair born of impulse or fleeting passion. This was calculated deception, meticulously planned and executed with the same chilling precision he employed to ensnare tax evaders. Yet, unlike the anonymous individuals he audited, Sarah had made one profound, critical error. She had profoundly underestimated the man she was lying to. David Albright had dedicated 15 years of his life to mastering the art of dismantling lies with nothing but paperwork and relentless patience. He knew how to trace clandestine money trails, how to unearth hidden assets, how to meticulously unravel the most intricately woven tapestries of lies. And now, every single one of those finely honed skills was about to be unleashed upon his own wife. The following morning found David seated in his cubicle at the imposing federal building, his gaze distant, fixed on his computer screen. Mark Jensen, a colleague whose cheerful banality usually offered a welcome distraction, was nearby, recounting his weekend plans with an infectious enthusiasm that seemed utterly foreign to David's current state. "You all right, man?" Mark inquired, leaning casually against David's desk, a slight frown creasing his brow. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," David replied, his voice flat, not bothering to lift his eyes from the monitor. "Sarah had me up late talking about redecorating." It was another minor fabrication, a trivial lie in the grand scheme of the monumental deceit he was navigating. David had, in fact, spent the majority of the night wide awake, his mind meticulously mapping out his next strategic moves like a grandmaster, anticipating every possible turn in a complex chess game. Mark merely shrugged, his attention already drifting, and ambled away, leaving David alone with his swirling thoughts. He pulled up the FBT database, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing in a name that now burned with a chilling significance: Julian Thorne. The man whose faint shadow had appeared so distinctly in Sarah's beach photos. David had meticulously extracted the metadata from those images, and the search results that now populated his screen sent a jolt, cold and sharp, through his veins, quickening his pulse with an almost predatory thrill. Julian Thorne, 35 years old, self-employed business consultant. 3 distinct addresses listed over the past 2 years. Reported annual income of $87,000. But David's experienced, I immediately detected the glaring discrepancies. The man claimed to generate his wealth from online coaching, yet his declared income bore no resemblance to the lavish lifestyle displayed across his vibrant social media profiles. Pictures of gleaming, expensive sports cars, extravagant dining experiences at high-end restaurants, and a barrage of motivational posts touting crypto freedom and the allure of escaping the 9 to 5 trap. It was a textbook case of fraud behavior, the very archetype David had encountered hundreds of times in his career. Individuals living ostentatiously beyond their reported means, fabricating income statements, establishing shell companies to conceal illicit assets. But this time, the deception was profoundly, agonizingly personal. David opened a new case file within the FBT system, not an official inquiry, not yet. He lacked the immediate, formal cause for that. This was his own clandestine investigation, meticulously conducted during snatched lunch breaks and long, solitary after-hour sessions. He commenced with the foundational elements, Julian's tax returns for the preceding 3 years. The man had boldly claimed substantial business expenses for travel and entertainment, including several documented trips to Riviera Maya. One of those trips precisely coincided with Sarah's enigmatic girls' weekend. David felt that familiar, exhilarating rush of discovery, the same deep satisfaction that surged through him whenever he successfully cornered a fraudster. But beneath this professional gratification, something far darker stirred within him, something cold, patient, and utterly unfamiliar. His phone buzzed. Another text from Sarah. Girls' night tonight with Michelle. Might be late. David stared at the message for a protracted moment, allowing the words to sink into the cold depths of his resolve before typing back. Have fun. I love you. The words felt like bitter ash on his tongue, but they served a crucial purpose. As long as Sarah perceived him as the same oblivious, trusting husband, she would continue to make mistakes. And David, with chilling precision, would meticulously document every single one. He minimized his browser and returned to his regular work, auditing a small business owner who had audaciously attempted to claim his pet dog as a security consultant. Under normal circumstances, David might have found the absurdity amusing. Today, it merely served as a stark reminder of the effortless ease with which people lied when they believed no one was watching. That evening, David sat in the quiet confines of his car, parked strategically outside the Obsidian Club, a trendy downtown bar where Sarah had claimed her girls' night was unfolding. He had been there for over 2 hours, a patient sentinel, observing the entrance through his rearview mirror. Neither Sarah's car nor Michelle's was present in the sprawling parking lot. Just before midnight, his phone vibrated. It was Sarah calling from her burner phone, though she remained blissfully unaware of his knowledge regarding its existence. "Hey, baby," she chirped, her voice lightly overlaid with a murmur of distant music. But David's keen ear immediately registered that it was not the Obsidian Club's signature jazz trio. This sounded distinctly like a hotel lounge, perhaps even a more secluded, intimate venue. "Just wanted to let you know I'm okay. Michelle had a little too much wine, so I'm driving her home." "That's thoughtful of you," David replied, his voice remarkably steady, devoid of any hint of the turmoil that raged within. "Drive safe." "Love you," she trilled, then disconnected the call. David remained in the silent cocoon of his car, watching his breath mist the windows. He felt something fundamental shifting within him, an irreversible transformation. The man who had once placed absolute trust in his wife was slowly dying, replaced by a colder, more calculating entity. He started the engine and drove home. But instead of seeking the solace of sleep, he retreated to his home office and opened his laptop. Project S had blossomed into an intricate web of multiple folders now, meticulously compiled financial records, incriminating social media screenshots, and even location data extracted from Sarah's primary phone. Data he'd learned to track using sophisticated software that bordered on, if not outright crossed, the line of legality. David no longer cared about legalities. His singular focus was truth, raw and unvarnished. He opened a new document, the cursor blinking expectantly, and began typing. Timeline of deception. S. Albright. Below that heading, he systematically began listing dates, times, and glaring inconsistencies. Every artful lie, every flimsy excuse, every single dollar spent on her clandestine life was documented with chilling precision. By the first light of dawn, he had compiled 17 damning pages of evidence. But evidence of what? Exactly? An affair was, by definition, ground for divorce. Yet, David was beginning to conceptualize a future far grander, far more devastating than a mere separation. He was beginning to envision consequences that would ripple through her life, irrevocably, for a lifetime. 3 days later, David was at his desk when his phone rang. The caller ID displayed his home number, a familiar comfort that now felt like a premonition. David, Sarah's voice was shaky, edged with a palpable panic. I need you to come home right now. What's wrong? David asked, his tone perfectly calibrated to convey concern, though he already knew. He had been waiting with a coiled anticipation for precisely this call. Someone broke into our safe deposit box, she explained, her words tumbling out. The bank called. They want us to come in immediately. David felt a subtle smile tug at the corner of his mouth, a grim satisfaction. I'll be right there. He ended the call, save his work with deliberate slowness, then informed Mark that he had a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. This was, without a doubt, going to be an emergency for his family. The drive home took a mere 12 minutes. David utilized every second of that brief journey to compose himself, to ensure his face bore the precise blend of appropriate concern and bewildered confusion. Sarah was frantically pacing their living room when he stepped through the front door. She looked genuinely terrified, a sight that was, for David, strangely gratifying. He had often wondered how she would react when the meticulously constructed edifice of her secret life began its inevitable, cascading collapse. They said someone accessed our box yesterday, she blurted out, foregoing any preamble. But I was at work all day, and you were too, right? Of course, I was at work, David affirmed, his voice level. What was in the box? The question hung in the air between them, a carefully laid trap. Sarah's eyes darted away from his, and David saw the precise moment the realization of her predicament dawned on her. If the box had contained only legitimate items, she would have simply, unhesitatingly, told him. Her hesitation, agonizing and prolonged, revealed everything. Just some jewelry, she said finally, her voice thin. My grandmother's ring. Another transparent lie. David had seen the contents of their safe deposit box 2 years prior when they had stored their house deed there. There had been no grandmother's ring. Should we call the police? David asked, his voice laced with an almost innocent curiosity. No, Sarah said quickly, her denial too vehement. I mean, maybe we should just see what the bank says first. It might be a mistake. David nodded, playing along perfectly. You're probably right. No point in getting worked up over nothing. But he could clearly see that Sarah was already worked up, profoundly so. Her hands trembled noticeably as she clutched her purse, and her gaze kept darting to her phone, as if anticipating a dreaded piece of news. Which, of course, she was, because David had purposefully left that bank receipt in the safe deposit box, nestled alongside a crisp note written in stark block letters. I know about Julian. He would let her spend the entire weekend consumed by gnawing uncertainty, wondering who knew and precisely how much they knew. He would allow her to panic, to make more impulsive, revealing mistakes. David was, after all, just getting started. By Monday morning, Sarah was a visible wreck. She had barely slept a wink all weekend, jumping at every ring of her phone, every incoming text message. David watched her with an almost scientific detachment, noting how frequently she checked her burner phone when she believed he wasn't looking. "Maybe you should stay home today," he suggested over breakfast, his voice tinged with a carefully feigned concern. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine," she snapped. Then, catching herself, softened her tone. "Sorry, I just haven't been sleeping well." "Anything you want to talk about?" David inquired, his voice suffused with the warm, solicitous tone of a concerned husband. For a fleeting moment, Sarah seemed on the verge of confessing everything. Her mouth parted slightly, and David glimpsed something vulnerable flicker across her strained face. Then, her phone buzzed, and the fragile moment of potential honesty passed. "It's nothing," she said, quickly dismissing it. "Just work stress." David nodded, returning to his cereal, but not before he'd caught a glimpse of the text preview on her screen. "We need to talk tonight from a contact listed, with pathetic transparency, as personal trainer." David had to grudgingly admire Julian Thorne's creativity with aliases, even if it was pathetically obvious. After Sarah left for work, David returned to his computer and opened a new browser window. It was time, he decided, to escalate the pressure. He logged into the FBT whistleblower portal and began meticulously filling out a report concerning Julian Thorne. The system was specifically designed for reporting tax fraud, and David knew precisely how to frame his concerns to trigger an immediate and thorough investigation. Suspected unreported income from online coaching business. Possible shell company fraud. Multiple addresses suggesting asset hiding. Lifestyle inconsistent with reported earnings. Every assertion was undeniably true, and every one was damning. David attached screenshots of Julian's lavish social media posts, showcasing his expensive purchases, alongside copies of his tax returns, which incongruously depicted poverty-level income. The beautiful, terrifying thing about FBT investigations was their inherent nature. They were slow, they were excruciatingly thorough, and they were ultimately absolutely devastating. Once Julian was flagged for audit, every facet of his financial life would be subjected to intense scrutiny under an unforgiving microscope. David submitted the report and leaned back in his chair, a grim satisfaction settling over him. In 6 to 8 weeks, Julian Thorne's carefully constructed world would begin its spectacular, irreversible collapse. The man would never know that his downfall had commenced with the audacious act of stealing another man's wife. But David wasn't done. The FBT investigation was merely the foundation, the initial tremor. He harbored far grander, more destructive designs. He opened his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he located investigator Evelyn Reed, a sharp, astute woman with whom he had collaborated on several complex financial crime cases. David had consistently proven an invaluable asset to her investigations, providing meticulous, insightful analysis of suspect transactions. It was time, he decided, to call in some long-standing favors. "Evelyn," he said when she answered, his voice calm and professional. "It's David Albright from the FBT. I might have something substantial for you." That evening, David was parked in his car outside the Grand Regency Hotel downtown when Sarah's modest Honda Civic pulled into the vast parking lot. She remained in her car for several long minutes, perhaps gathering her resolve for whatever difficult conversation awaited her. David had already secured a room on the third floor, situated directly above where Julian's car was habitually parked. He had observed the man's Instagram post from this very hotel on previous occasions. Was, apparently, his preferred venue for clandestine business meetings. David took the elevator up to his room and meticulously set up his laptop by the window. He had made some rather interesting investments in specialized equipment over the past week. A parabolic microphone designed to capture distant conversations, a high-resolution camera equipped with a powerful telephoto lens, and advanced recording software capable of enhancing audio from remarkable distances. All of it, he noted with a grim smile, was perfectly legal surveillance equipment, the very kind routinely employed by professional private investigators. Just after 8 in the evening, Sarah entered the hotel lobby. A few minutes later, she knocked quietly on the door of Suite 305. David's parabolic microphone, positioned with surgical precision, picked up their subsequent conversation with startling clarity. "You're sure no one followed you?" Julian's voice was tense, edged with a palpable paranoia. "I don't think so," Sarah replied, her voice strained. "But Julian, I'm scared. Someone knows about us." "What exactly did the note say?" "Just I know about Julian." "That's it. But how would anyone even know your name?" David smiled in the near darkness of his hotel room. "Because you've been sloppy, sweetheart. Because you thought your boring husband was too stupid to notice." "Maybe it's just someone fishing," Julian suggested, his voice betraying a hint of forced bravado. "Like they suspect something but don't have proof." "Or maybe it's David," Sarah whispered, and David's breath caught, a sharp, almost painful intake. "Maybe he's been watching me." Julian laughed, a dismissive, derisive sound that grated on David's nerves. "Your husband? That guy couldn't find his way out of a paper bag. You said yourself he's completely clueless." The casual contempt in Julian's voice ignited something cold and incandescently furious in David's chest. He reached for his phone, his fingers steady, and began recording video through the window, capturing Julian's car parked innocuously below. "I don't know," Sarah continued, her voice uncertain. "He's been acting strange lately. Quiet, like he's thinking about something." "You're paranoid," Julian retorted, his tone dismissive. "Look, even if someone does know, what are they going to do? You're not breaking any laws by having an affair." David's smile widened, a thin, predatory line. "Oh, but you're breaking laws, Julian. So many laws." He opened his laptop and pulled up the meticulously constructed dossier he'd been building on Julian Thorne. Tax evasion was merely the tip of the iceberg. David had already unearthed compelling evidence of wire fraud, mail fraud, and flagrant securities violations. Julian's crypto coaching business was, in reality, a sophisticated, meticulously orchestrated Ponzi scheme, promising guaranteed returns while cynically using new investor money to pay off earlier investors. The man was staring down the barrel of serious federal prison time. He just didn't know it yet. David continued recording, his focus unwavering, as the conversation drifted into more intimate, personal territory. Sarah complaining about the stagnant intimacy of her marriage. Julian making grand, hollow promises about their future together. Standard affair dialogue, which David documented with chilling, detached methodicalness. Later that night, they finally exited the room together. David watched from his window as they exchanged a lingering kiss goodbye in the parking lot. Julian's hands wandered, moving in ways that made David's jaw clench, but he kept recording. Evidence was evidence, and emotions, however raw, were, in this pursuit, utterly irrelevant. David packed up his equipment, each piece returned to its case with precise movements, and checked out of the hotel seamlessly using the app on his phone. By the time Sarah arrived home, a little before midnight, he was already in bed, feigning deep slumber. She slipped into the bathroom to shower, and David heard her soft, muffled sobs under the running water. For just a fleeting moment, a flicker of his old sympathy stirred within him. This was still his wife, still the woman he had loved, or believed he loved, for 16 years. Then he remembered Julian's dismissive voice. That guy couldn't find his way out of a paper bag. The nascent sympathy died as quickly as it had come, replaced by a renewed surge of cold determination. The next morning brought the first true, unadulterated satisfaction David had felt in weeks. His phone rang just before dawn. It was Investigator Reed. "David, that tip you gave me about Julian Thorne paid off big time," she announced, her voice vibrant with professional excitement. "We've been tracking a fraud ring for months, and your guy is right in the middle of it." David felt his pulse quicken, a controlled surge of adrenaline. "What kind of fraud?" he asked, feigning surprise. "Investment scam? Cryptocurrency coaching? That's actually just a pyramid scheme. We're talking about hundreds of victims, maybe millions in damages." Evelyn's voice crackled with the kind of excitement police officers exhibited when a complex case finally clicked into place. "How did you know to look at this guy?" "Anonymous tip came through our fraud hotline." David lied smoothly, his voice devoid of any tell. "I just followed up on the financial discrepancies." "Well, whoever called it in just helped us crack a major case. We're moving fast on this one, probably executing search warrants by the end of the week." David closed his eyes, savoring the precise, meticulously orchestrated moment. "Glad I could help," he said quietly. After hanging up, he sat alone in his kitchen, allowing himself a small, measured sip of cold coffee and a larger, more profound smile. Julian Thorne was about to discover, in the most devastating way possible, what happened when you gravely underestimated a federal tax auditor. But David's grim satisfaction was abruptly interrupted by the insistent buzzing of Sarah's phone upstairs. Then again, then a third time, in rapid succession, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her bathrobe, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. "What do you mean, arrested?" she said, her voice sharp with panic, cutting through the morning stillness. David pretended to be engrossed in his newspaper, his senses acutely tuned to every word. "Michelle, slow down. What did they arrest you for?" "Michelle." David had almost forgotten about Sarah's friend, the one who had so enthusiastically encouraged her to explore her options. He had wondered, with a certain cold anticipation, when she would surface in this unfolding tapestry of embezzlement. Sarah's voice rose to a near shriek, the sound echoing from the dental clinic. "Michelle, that's impossible." But it was far from impossible. David had spent a considerable amount of time over the past week meticulously studying the clinic's financial records. As a dental receptionist, Michelle had unfettered access to patient payment systems, and she had been discreetly skimming cash payments for over a year. David had simply ensured that the right people within the clinic's administration noticed the glaring discrepancies. "I have to go," Sarah said into the phone, her voice strained. "I need a call and sick to work." She hung up abruptly, staring at her phone for a long, disbelieving moment, then looked down at David, her eyes wide with shock. "Michelle's been arrested," she whispered, her voice hollow, devoid of its usual vivacity. "Your friend for the clinic?" David looked up with an expression of perfectly feigned surprise. "What for?" "They're saying she stole money, but David, that's crazy. Michelle would never." "People do surprising things when they're desperate," David said mildly, his gaze unwavering. "You never really know someone, do you?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a double meaning that only David fully comprehended. Sarah stared at him for another moment, then turned and ascended the stairs again. David heard her making frantic phone calls, desperately trying to reach Michelle's lawyer, trying to comprehend how her seemingly stable world was suddenly, inexplicably, falling apart. David returned to his newspaper, but his mind was already, relentlessly, moving to the next phase of his meticulously crafted plan. Michelle's arrest was merely a warm-up act. The main event was still to come. By Thursday, Sarah was a nervous wreck. Michelle's arrest had been followed by a second, equally devastating shock. The dental clinic had summarily fired Sarah, pending an internal investigation into her own finances. Apparently, Michelle, under intense questioning, had implicated her in the embezzlement scheme. David knew this because he had meticulously ensured Michelle had just enough manufactured evidence to believe Sarah was genuinely involved. A few subtly forged receipts, some cleverly manipulated account records, and Michelle's raw desperation had done the rest. "I don't understand how this is happening," Sarah cried, pacing frantically around their living room, her steps agitated. "First Michelle, now they're questioning me. It's like someone is targeting us." David looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. "Who will want to target you?" "I don't know." Sarah's voice cracked, close to breaking. "Maybe someone at the clinic who wanted Michelle's job. Or maybe—" She trailed off, her eyes wide, but David could clearly see the frantic gears turning in her head. "Maybe what?" he prompted softly. "Nothing. It's stupid." But her eyes kept darting instinctively to her phone, and David knew, with cold certainty, that she was thinking about the ominous note he had left in the safe deposit box. David's own phone buzzed then. A text from Investigator Reed. "Big news on the Thorne case. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" David typed back instantly, "Of course." "What's the development?" "Search warrants executed today. Your fraud tip was just the beginning. This guy's operation is massive." David allowed himself another small, secret smile. "Right on schedule." "Sarah," he said, closing his laptop with a decisive snap. "Why don't we go out to dinner tonight? Somewhere nice. We both need to get out of the house." She looked at him suspiciously, a flicker of distrust in her exhausted eyes. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern. "You've been acting strange lately." "I've been worried about you," David said, which technically was true. He was worried about what she might do, how she might react, when his elaborate plan reached its inevitable, brutal conclusion. "All this stress with Michelle, your job situation. I thought a nice dinner might help." Sarah's expression softened slightly, a hint of her old self breaking through the fear. "That's sweet, but I don't really feel like going out." "Come on," David pressed, his tone persuasive. "How about that steakhouse you like? The one downtown?" He was persistent because he needed her out of the house. Tonight was the night Investigator Reed's team would be executing the search warrant on Julian's apartment, and David intended to be there to watch. Not officially, of course, merely as a concerned citizen who happened to be driving by. "Okay," Sarah said finally, resignation in her voice. "But I might not be very good company." "You don't have to be anything but yourself," David replied, and he meant every word. After all, being herself was precisely what had initiated this devastating cascade of events. Dinner was an agonizing charade. Sarah picked at her food, barely touching it, while compulsively checking her phone every few minutes, clearly distracted by some unseen, pressing concern. David made polite, small talk about his work, the mundane weather, anything to fill the vast, uncomfortable silences that stretched between them. Around 8:30, Sarah excused herself, claiming a need to use the restroom. David watched her walk away, then quickly checked his own phone. A new text from Investigator Reed. "In progress. This is even bigger than we thought." When Sarah returned, her face was pale, almost translucent. "Everything okay?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Fine," she murmured, but her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she slid back into her seat. "David, can we go home? I'm getting a headache." "Of course." They drove home in silence, Sarah staring blankly out the window, her expression that of someone whose entire world was collapsing around them. David felt a brief, fleeting moment of what might have been pity, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Upon arriving home, Sarah went directly upstairs, claiming an immediate need to lie down. David waited until he heard the soft click of the bedroom door, then grabbed his keys and headed back out. Julian's apartment building was a mere 15 minutes away, and David could already discern the flashing blue lights of police cars from 2 blocks distant. He parked discreetly across the street and watched, a silent observer, as uniformed officers carried box after box of evidence out of the building. His phone rang. Investigator Reed. "David, you need to see this," she said without preamble, her voice breathless with discovery. "Can you come down to the station tomorrow? I want to show you what we found. This is significant. This guy wasn't just running a crypto scam. He was laundering money for other major operations, running fake charities, identity theft, the works. And David, some of the bank accounts we found have your wife's name on them." David's breath hitched, a perfectly executed reaction. He had suspected Sarah was involved in Julian's schemes, but this depth of involvement was far beyond what he had initially envisioned. "My wife?" he uttered, his voice carefully pitched to convey a profound, heart-wrenching shock. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this way, but yes," Evelyn continued, her tone genuinely sympathetic. "It looks like she might be more involved than just having an affair." David closed his eyes, allowing the magnitude of the moment to wash over him. "Perfect. Better than perfect. I'll be there first thing in the morning," he said, his voice laced with manufactured despair. "David, I'm really sorry about this. I know this has to be devastating." "Thank you," David said quietly, his voice full of feigned gratitude. "I appreciate that." He ended the call and remained in his car, watching the police conclude their work, the scene playing out like the final act of a carefully rehearsed drama. Julian himself was nowhere in sight, undoubtedly already in custody at a federal holding facility. David started his car and drove home. As he walked through his front door, he could hear Sarah's soft, broken sobs from upstairs. Time for the next phase. David knocked softly on the bedroom door. "Sarah, can I come in?" The crying ceased abruptly. "Just a minute." When she finally opened the door, her eyes were red and swollen, clearly having been weeping for hours. "What's wrong?" David asked, though he already knew every beat of the unfolding tragedy, perfectly anticipated. "It's nothing, just everything with Michelle and work," she said, gesturing helplessly, her world in disarray. David stepped closer, his gaze scrutinizing her ravaged face. "Sarah, is there something you're not telling me?" The question hung between them, a loaded weapon. Sarah's eyes darted away from his, and David saw the exact moment she decided, once more, to cling to her lies. "No," she said, her voice thin and unconvincing. "I'm just stressed about Michelle's situation." David nodded slowly. "I understand, but Sarah, if there's anything you need to tell me, anything at all, now would truly be the time." Another meticulously crafted opportunity to confess. Another final chance to come clean before his plan reached its brutal, irreversible culmination. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and David could see her weighing her options. Divulge the truth and confront the immediate consequences, or persist in her deception and hope, foolishly, for the best. "There's nothing to tell," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. David offered a sad, almost regretful smile. "Okay, if you're sure." He turned to leave, then paused dramatically at the doorway. "Oh, I almost forgot. Investigator Reed called. She wants to meet with me tomorrow morning about a case I've been helping with. Something about financial fraud." Sarah went completely still, her breath catching. "What kind of fraud?" "Investment scam. I think some guy who was running fake cryptocurrency courses." David kept his voice light, casual, as if discussing the weather. "Mills said they made arrests today." The color drained from Sarah's face entirely, leaving her looking ghostly pale. "Did she say what the man's name was?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thorne, I think. Julian Thorne." Sarah made a small, choked sound, almost a whimper. David turned around, his face a perfect mask of concerned bewilderment. "Do you know that name?" "No," Sarah said quickly. Too quickly, her denial transparent, desperate. "No, I've never heard of him." The lie was so utterly blatant, so pathetically transparent, that David almost felt a twinge of embarrassment for her. "Okay," he said gently. "Well, I should let you get some rest. Big day tomorrow." He left her standing in the doorway, watching him with the wide, terrified expression of someone who had just realized they were standing precariously on the very edge of a precipice. David went downstairs and poured himself a glass of wine. Tomorrow, Investigator Reed would undeniably present him with the incontrovertible evidence linking Sarah to Julian's intricate schemes. Tomorrow, the final, devastating piece of his revenge would fall into its appointed place. But tonight, he was going to sit in his living room in the quiet solitude and savor the profound satisfaction of a meticulously orchestrated plan coming together with absolute perfection. Upstairs, he could faintly hear Sarah making frantic phone calls, probably desperately trying to reach Julian, blissfully unaware that her lover was already sitting in a federal holding cell, likely making his own desperate, futile calls to lawyers who, ultimately, could offer him no real help. David raised his wine glass in a silent, grim toast to the cheerful yellow kitchen walls that had seemed so mockingly vibrant just a few weeks ago. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Friday morning arrived, gray and cold, its bleakness mirroring David's own internal mood as he drove to the police station. He had barely slept, not from anxiety, but from a taut, electrifying anticipation. Today was the day everything he had meticulously planned would finally converge. Investigator Reed met him in the bustling lobby, her expression grim, laced with a professional sympathy. "Thanks for coming in so early," she said, her voice low, leading him toward the elevator. "I know this is going to be difficult." David nodded, playing the part of the distraught but stoic husband with perfect conviction. Evelyn's office was small and perpetually cluttered, files stacked precariously everywhere, and coffee cups in various stages of abandonment. She gestured for David to take a seat, then opened a thick, imposing folder on her desk. "David, I need to ask you some questions about your wife's finances," she began, her tone gentle but firm. "Of course, whatever you need. Are you aware of any bank accounts she might have that aren't in both your names?" David pretended to ponder the question deeply, furrowing his brow. "I don't think so. We've always shared everything financially." "What?" Evelyn pulled out a series of bank statements and slid them deliberately across the desk. "We found these accounts in our search of Julian Thorne's records. They're under your wife's name and social security number." David examined the documents with a perfectly calibrated expression of profound shock. The accounts revealed deposits totaling over $150,000 in the past 6 months, all originating from Julian's various shell companies. "I don't understand," David said, his voice meticulously calibrated to convey a bewildering mixture of confusion and gut-wrenching betrayal. "Sarah never mentioned any of this." "There's more," Evelyn said gently, her voice conveying genuine regret. She pulled out another set of damning documents. "We found records showing that your wife was actively recruiting investors for Julian's cryptocurrency scheme. She was getting a percentage of every person she brought in. The recruiting records were particularly damning, precisely because David had created them himself, using Sarah's personal information and skillfully forging her signature on the partnership agreements. A little creative accounting on his part had made it appear as though she had been Julian's willing business partner all along." "She was working with him?" David asked, his voice hollow, feigning utter disbelief. "It looks that way. I am sorry, David. I know this is a lot to process." David stared at the papers in his hands, allowing the manufactured weight of betrayal to settle over him, pressing down with calculated heaviness. In reality, Sarah had likely never known the true extent of Julian's business operations beyond his surface-level coaching scam. But the irrefutable evidence Evelyn was now showing him painted a horrifying, undeniable picture of a wife who had been systematically defrauding unsuspecting individuals while simultaneously lying to her unsuspecting husband. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll need to interview her today, if possible." Evelyn hesitated, her gaze softening. "And David, you should probably go lawyer. Not because you're in trouble, but because this is going to get very, very complicated." David nodded numbly, a performance of dazed acceptance. "Should I tell her you want to talk to her?" "We'd prefer to approach her ourselves," Evelyn replied. "But you might want to prepare yourself for the possibility that she'll be arrested." "Arrested?" David's voice cracked slightly, a subtle but effective touch, he thought. "The evidence is pretty clear that she was an active participant in defrauding victims. We're talking about potential federal charges." David closed his eyes, letting the full, terrible magnitude of the moment wash over him. Federal charges meant prison time. Real, crushing prison time, not just the divorce and financial ruin he had initially envisioned. "I need some air," he said, rising from his chair with a convincing, shaky movement. "Of course, take all the time you need. And David, I really am sorry about this." David thanked her, his voice a strained whisper, and walked out of the station, his mind already racing ahead, meticulously calculating what would happen next. Sarah would be arrested within hours. She would undoubtedly try to call him from jail, desperately seeking bail money and legal assistance. And David would have to decide just how much mercy he was willing to extend. David sat in his car outside the police station, taking deep, measured breaths, preparing for what he knew would be the performance of his life. His phone was already ringing, a frantic, insistent buzz. It was Sarah, undoubtedly wondering where he was, demanding his presence. He let it ring, allowing it to go to voicemail, then listened to the message. "David, where are you? There are police cars outside our house. I am scared. Please call me back." The fear in her voice was raw, visceral, undeniably real. And for just a fleeting moment, a ghost of something akin to regret stirred within David. But then he remembered Julian's dismissive laugh, the casual, cutting way he had dismissed David as harmless and stupid. David started his car, choosing the long, circuitous route home, giving the police ample time to complete their work. When he finally turned onto his street, the police cars were gone. His house looked utterly normal from the outside, but David knew, with cold certainty, that nothing inside, nothing in their lives, would ever be normal again. He found Sarah in their living room, seated on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up when he walked in, and her face was a map of terror and profound confusion. "They arrested me," she said simply, her voice flat, hollow. David sat down across from her, maintaining a careful, almost clinical distance. "What for?" "Fraud, securities violations, money laundering." Her voice was devoid of emotion, numb with shock. David, I don't understand any of this. They show me bank accounts I've never seen, documents with my signature that I never signed. The desperate innocence in her voice almost swayed David. Almost. Where were you for the past 3 hours? He asked, his tone level. At the police station. They questioned me for hours about Julian, about investments, about money. She looked at him with pleading, bloodshot eyes. David, I swear to you, I don't know anything about this business stuff. I never signed any papers. David studied her face carefully. Was she truly lying? Or had Julian indeed kept her completely in the dark about the true extent of his illicit operations? At this point, David realized it barely mattered which was true. But you do know Julian, David said quietly, his voice a low, ominous hum. The words hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Sarah's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Initial surprise, then denial, a surge of fear, and finally, a profound, weary resignation. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know Julian. It was the first completely, unequivocally honest thing she had said to him in months. How long? David asked. 6 months. Maybe 7. Tears were now streaming down her face, a torrent of belated remorse. David, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. How far did you mean for it to go? David pressed, his voice devoid of warmth. Sarah looked down at her clasped hands. I don't know. I felt invisible, like you didn't see me anymore. And Julian made me feel special. David felt a familiar cold settling in his chest, an icy grip around his heart. Special enough to lie to me for 7 months? Special enough to open secret bank accounts? Special enough to help him steal from people? I never helped him steal. Sarah protested, her voice rising in desperation. I didn't know about any business stuff. We talked. We went out sometimes. I never signed any papers. The police seemed to think differently. Sarah's face crumpled, her shoulders shaking with deep, wrenching sobs. David, you have to believe me. I made a terrible mistake having an affair, but I'm not a criminal. Someone is setting me up. David stood up and walked to the window. Outside, their neighbor was serenely mowing his lawn, utterly oblivious to the raw, devastating drama unfolding next door. The sheer normalcy of it felt profoundly surreal. Who would set you up, Sarah? I don't know. Maybe Julian. Maybe he used my information without telling me. David turned back to face her, his gaze unyielding. Or maybe you're lying to me again. The accusation struck her like a physical blow, an emotional impact that doubled her over, sobbing harder than David had ever seen her cry, her body racked with anguish. I'm not lying about this, she choked out through her tears. David, I swear on my mother's grave, I never signed any business documents. I never knew about any fraud. David studied her carefully. Her grief seemed genuine, her confusion undeniably real. It was, he conceded, entirely possible that Julian had used her identity without her knowledge. It was also equally possible that she was an exceptionally accomplished liar. At this point, David realized it didn't truly matter which was true. The police will figure it out, he said finally, his voice flat. If you're innocent, the truth will come out. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with a desperate, fragile hope. You believe me? David met her gaze steadily, unflinchingly. I believe that you had an affair with a man who turned out to be a criminal. Everything else, we'll see what the evidence shows. It wasn't the unconditional support she had been desperately hoping for, but it wasn't outright rejection either. Sarah seemed to take what small comfort she could from his carefully chosen words. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Now you get a lawyer. A good one, David. She hesitated, then plunged ahead, a raw desperation in her voice. I know I don't have any right to ask this, but will you help me? I don't have money for a lawyer. My bank accounts are frozen, and with the clinic situation, David looked at his wife, really looked at her. 7 months ago, she had been self-assured and dismissive, treating him like a convenient roommate who merely paid the bills. Now, she was utterly broken, terrified, and completely dependent on his mercy. The irony was exquisite, a refined, bitter taste on his tongue. "I'll think about it," he said, turning away. That evening, David sat in his home office, ostensibly absorbed in legitimate tax audits, but in reality, meticulously reviewing the final, intricate stages of his plan. Sarah was upstairs, probably making desperate, futile phone calls to lawyers she couldn't possibly afford. His computer chimed with the alert of a new email. Investigator Reed, updating him on the case. "David, thought you should know that we executed a search warrant on your house this afternoon while you were out. We didn't find anything connecting you to Thorne's operation, which is what we expected. However, we did find some additional evidence in your wife's possession that strengthens the case against her. I can't go into details, but her lawyer will be briefed on everything. Again, I'm sorry you're going through this. Evelyn." David smiled, a chilling, private satisfaction. The additional evidence had been meticulously planted by David himself over the past week. Subtly forged contracts hidden deep within Sarah's jewelry box. A burner phone pre-programmed with incriminating text messages that seemed to implicate her complicity, and a safe deposit box key that led to even more carefully planted, damning evidence. Every single piece was designed, with meticulous precision, to make Sarah appear to have been Julian's willing, active partner in crime. His phone rang, an unknown number. "Mr. Albright, this is attorney Richard Davies from Davies & Chambers. Your wife asked me to call you." A lawyer. David had been expecting this call, anticipating its precise timing. "What can I do for you, Mr. Davies?" "I've agreed to represent your wife, but I need to discuss payment arrangements. Mrs. Albright says her assets are frozen and she's unable to pay my retainer. How much are we talking about for a case this complex, with federal charges involved?" "I'd estimate at least $50,000 just to get started," Davies said, his voice measured. "Potentially much more if it goes to trial." David let the number hang in the air, a vast, oppressive sum. $50,000 to defend a woman who had systematically betrayed him for 7 months. "Mr. Albright, are you still there?" "I'm here. I need some time to think about this." "I understand, but I should tell you that time is a significant factor. The prosecution is moving quickly on this case, and your wife needs representation immediately." "I'll get back to you tomorrow," David said, and ended the call. He leaned back in his chair, savoring the profound power of the moment. Sarah's entire future now hinged precariously on his generosity. Her freedom, her reputation, her very life. All of it was now firmly within his hands. The very same hands she had once believed were too weak, too ineffectual to fight back. David opened his laptop and began diligently researching federal sentencing guidelines for financial fraud. The penalties were undeniably severe, up to 20 years in prison for major violations, in addition to full restitution to victims and forfeiture of all assets. Even if Sarah was genuinely innocent of the deeper business fraud, the manufactured evidence David had so expertly concocted would prove exceedingly difficult to explain away. At a bare minimum, she was staring down the barrel of several years in federal prison, unless David, in an act of calculated grace, chose to help her. He closed his laptop and ascended the stairs. Sarah was sitting on their bed, staring blankly at her phone, her eyes still red-rimmed. "Any luck with lawyers?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. She looked up, her expression a mix of exhaustion and despair. "3 of them want $50,000 up front. Two won't take the case at all. One wants 125,000 retainer. David sat down beside her, maintaining the careful, unbreachable distance that had become their new normal. Sarah, I need you to tell me everything. Not just about the affair, but about anything you might have done with Julian that could be construed as business-related. She turned to face him, a fragile flicker of hope in her expression. Does that mean you'll help me? It means I'm considering it, but I need the whole truth, Sarah. Sarah took a shaky breath, her body trembling slightly. Okay, Julian did ask me to recommend his coaching program to some people, friends, family. He said he'd give me a small commission if anyone signed up. David's pulse quickened, a thrill of confirmation. Did anyone sign up? A few people. My cousin Chloe, my co-worker Brenda, maybe 3 or 4 others. She was speaking quickly now, eager to unburden herself, desperate to confess. But David, I thought it was legitimate. He showed me testimonials, success stories. I really believed he was helping people. How much commission did you make? Maybe $2,000 total. I used it to buy clothes, get my hair done. I never thought. She trailed off, a dawning, terrible understanding spreading across her face. Oh God, that's how they're saying I was his business partner. David nodded gravely. Probably. And if those people lost money in his scheme, you could be liable for restitution. But I didn't know it was a scam. The law doesn't always care what you knew, David stated, his voice devoid of emotion. It cares what you should have known. Sarah buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with renewed sobs. I'm going to prison, aren't I? David considered his answer carefully. This was the pivotal moment, the precise juncture where he could offer a lifeline of hope or deliver the final, crushing blow. Not necessarily, he said finally, his voice measured. Good lawyers can work miracles, but they're expensive. Will you help me? The question was barely a whisper, a desperate plea hanging in the air. David stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting behind the neighbor's house, casting long, melancholic shadows across their yard. I'll pay for your lawyer, he said, without turning around. He heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, then the renewed sound of her crying, this time unequivocally with profound relief. Thank you, she sobbed, her voice thick with emotion. David, thank you so much. I know I don't deserve this, but thank you. David turned back to face her, his expression unyielding. There are conditions. Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding eagerly, desperate for any terms. Anything. First, you tell your lawyer everything. Every single detail about your relationship with Julian. Every conversation you had about his business. Every penny you made. No lies, no omissions. Of course. Of course. Second, you sign a post-nuptial agreement giving me sole ownership of all our assets. The house, the cars, our savings, my retirement accounts, everything. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, her brow furrowed in thought, then nodded, a reluctant acceptance. Okay. Third, when this is over, whether you're convicted or acquitted, our marriage is irrevocably over. I'll file for divorce, and you'll agree to all terms without contest. This time, her hesitation was longer, more profound. David could see her frantically weighing her options, agree to his terms, and lose everything material, but potentially remain free or refuse and face devastating federal charges alone. I understand, she said finally, her voice thin. And fourth, David continued, his voice taking on a harder, almost predatory edge, you never contact Julian again. Not through lawyers, not through friends, not even to ask him to testify on your behalf. As far as you're concerned, he doesn't exist. David, he might be able to help clear my name, Sarah pleaded, a desperate glimmer of hope in her eyes. If he testifies that I wasn't really involved in the business. Julian Thorne is looking at 25 years in federal prison, David said coldly, cutting her off. He's going to say whatever he thinks will reduce his sentence. Do you really want to bet your freedom on the word of a man who's already proven he'll lie to anyone about anything? Sarah considered this, then slowly, reluctantly, shook her head. No, you're right. Good. David pulled out his phone and dialed attorney Richard Davies' number. Mr. Davies, it's David Albright. I'll be transferring $50,000 to your account tomorrow morning. When can you start working on my wife's case? The relief that flooded Sarah's face was almost painful to witness. She looked at David like he was her savior, her knight in shining armor riding to her rescue. If only she knew that he was also the meticulous architect of her destruction. The next 2 weeks passed in a disorienting blur of lawyer meetings, tense court appearances, and a relentless, intrusive media attention. The Julian Thorne case had drawn considerable local news coverage, and several prominent outlets had unceremoniously identified Sarah as a key, if somewhat peripheral, figure in the unfolding investigation. David observed it all with the detached, almost clinical interest of a scientist meticulously observing a complex experiment. Sarah grew visibly thinner, her face more haggard with each passing day, jumping reflexively at every phone call and spending endless, anxious hours researching federal sentencing guidelines online. Richard Davies, however, was earning his substantial fee. He had skillfully managed to secure Sarah's release on bond and was diligently constructing a defense predicated on her being a victim of Julian's sophisticated manipulation rather than a willing, culpable participant. David had to concede it was a solid, if audacious, strategy. Sarah genuinely seemed to have been ignorant of the true scope and depth of Julian's widespread fraud, and her lawyer was expertly painting her as a naive, trusting wife who had been tragically seduced by a professional con artist. The central problem, however, remained the meticulously planted evidence David had so carefully introduced. The forged contracts were particularly damaging, especially since they bore what appeared to be Sarah's unmistakable signature. "How are you holding up?" David asked her one evening as she meticulously reviewed dense legal documents at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah looked up, her eyes weary, bloodshot. "Davies thinks we have a good chance of avoiding the major charges. Maybe just a misdemeanor for the commission payments. That will be the best possible outcome. David, I need to ask you something." She set down her papers with a deliberate sigh and looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. "Do you think I'm guilty?" The question caught him off guard, not because he didn't know the answer, but because of the profound, raw vulnerability with which she asked it and how much the answer still seemed to matter to her. Of having an affair? Yes. Of deliberately defrauding people? I don't know, but you're still helping me. David considered his words carefully, choosing them with the precision of a seasoned diplomat. "I'm helping because, guilty or innocent, you're still my wife. And because I believe everyone deserves a fair defense." It was a politician's answer, saying absolutely nothing while sounding profoundly noble. But it seemed to satisfy Sarah, at least for now. "I'm going to make this right," she said earnestly, her voice filled with a desperate resolve. "When this is over, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for what I did to our marriage." David nodded, but said nothing. There would be no rest of their life together. When this was finally over, Sarah would be financially ruined, legally vulnerable, and utterly alone, precisely as David had felt when he first unearthed her devastating betrayal. His phone buzzed with a text from Investigator Reed. "Thorne pleaded guilty today. 15 years federal prison. Case against your wife just got stronger. He's refusing to cooperate or testify for anyone." David showed the message to Sarah, watching her face go pale, the last vestiges of color draining from her cheeks. He pleaded guilty, she whispered, her voice barely audible. 15 years? He's not getting out until he's 50. Sarah stared at the phone screen for a long, disbelieving moment, the grim reality settling over her. He's really not going to help me, is he? Would you expect him to? She shook her head slowly, a profound weariness in her movements. I guess I always thought if this got really bad, he'd tell the truth about my involvement or lack of involvement. Sarah, you need to understand something, David said gently, his voice almost paternal. Julian used you. Maybe he cared about you as a person, but ultimately, you were merely useful to him. Now that you're no longer useful, he has absolutely no reason to help you. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. David could see her processing the full, devastating implications of her situation, abandoned by her lover, facing crushing federal charges, and utterly dependent on the precarious mercy of the husband she had so carelessly betrayed. I really screwed up, didn't I? She said quietly, her voice raw, devoid of its usual artifice. It was the first time David had heard her use such unvarnished, self-incriminating language about her predicament. Yes, he said simply. You did. 3 weeks later, attorney Richard Davies called David with news that, in an instant, altered everything. The prosecution wants to make a deal, he informed David over the phone, his voice tinged with a cautious optimism. They're offering a plea agreement. David was seated in his office at work, but he gave Davies his full, undivided attention. What kind of deal? Guilty plea to 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 2 years probation, full restitution to victims, about $43,000, and a $10,000 fine. David did a quick mental calculation. $53,000 in financial penalties, plus the $50,000 he'd already paid Davies, plus ongoing legal fees. Over $100,000 total. What's the alternative? Trial. If she's convicted on all counts, she's looking at 8 to 12 years in federal prison. What does she want to do? She wants to talk to you first. Mr. Albright, I have to tell you, this is a very good offer. The prosecution usually doesn't offer deals this favorable, unless they're worried about their case. After hanging up, David sat quietly in his cubicle, meticulously considering his options. He could encourage Sarah to accept the deal, thereby ensuring her freedom but saddling her with immense debt and a permanent criminal record. Or he could push her toward a trial, gambling on a complete vindication, but risking her spending the next decade of her life in prison. Either way, his revenge would be complete. Sarah's life, as she had known, it was irrevocably over. His phone rang. It was Sarah, calling from home. Did Davies tell you about the plea offer? She asked immediately, her voice strained. He did. What are you thinking? I am scared, David. 2 years probation means I can't leave the state. I have to check in with the probation officer, and I'll have a federal conviction on my record forever. But you'll be free, David countered. Will I? I'll never be able to get a decent job with a fraud conviction. We'll lose the house trying to pay restitution. And everyone in town knows about this now. I can't even go to the grocery store without people staring. David realized she was right. Even if she avoided prison, Sarah's life in Beacon Hill was effectively over. She'd be a convicted felon in a town where her story was a public spectacle. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to fight it. Davies thinks we have a real chance at trial. The planted evidence is so obviously fake, and Julian's refusal to cooperate actually helps us. It shows he's vindictive and untrustworthy. David's blood went cold, a sudden, icy shock. Planted evidence? The contracts they found in my jewelry box, she continued, her voice gaining strength, conviction. Davies had them analyzed by a handwriting expert. The signatures are forgeries. Really good ones, but still fake. Someone planted them to make me look guilty. David's mind raced, a sudden, frantic scramble for control. The handwriting expert was a variable he had not anticipated, a contingency he had failed to foresee. He had been meticulous with the forgeries, but apparently not meticulous enough. "Who would plant evidence against you?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, masking the sudden tremor of panic. "Davies thinks maybe Julian did it before he was arrested. Like he knew he was going down and wanted to drag me with him. Or maybe someone in his organization who wanted to deflect attention from themselves." David felt a moment of genuine, raw panic. If Davies could prove the documents were planted, it would undeniably raise questions about all the other evidence against Sarah. Questions that might eventually lead back to David himself. "Are you sure you want to risk a trial?" he asked, his voice now edged with a carefully constructed concern. "Even if you win, the legal costs will be enormous." "David, if I take this plea deal, my life is over anyway. At least at trial, I have a chance to clear my name completely." David closed his eyes, a grim acceptance. This was not how his meticulously crafted plan was supposed to end. Sarah was supposed to be broken and utterly defeated, accepting whatever sliver of mercy he chose to offer. Instead, she was finding a strength, a defiant resolve he hadn't known she possessed. "It's your decision," he said finally, the words tasting like ash. "Whatever you choose, I'll support you." But even as he uttered the words, David was already planning his next desperate move. If Sarah wanted a fight, he would give her a fight, but he would make damned sure she didn't win. That evening, David sat in his car outside attorney Richard Davies' law office, patiently waiting for Sarah's appointment to conclude. She had gone in 2 hours ago to discuss trial strategy, and David had used the intervening time to make some calls of his own. Investigator Reed had been keenly interested in David's newly presented theory about additional evidence that might still exist. David had subtly suggested that Julian might have kept backup files on Sarah's involvement, files that the original search might have missed. "It's just a thought," David had said modestly, feigning a casual suggestion. But if he was as paranoid as he seems, he might have documented everything twice. Evelyn had promised to look into it, which meant another, more thorough search of Julian's properties. And David had made sure there would indeed be something damning to find. The office door opened, and Sarah emerged, looking more determined, more resolute than David had seen her in weeks. She got into the car with an unusual energy that immediately put him on high alert. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Good, really good." Her voice was vibrant with renewed hope. "Davies thinks we can get the planted evidence thrown out entirely, which fundamentally undermines the prosecution's whole case." She turned to face him, and David saw something in her expression that made his stomach clench, a knot of unease tightening within him. "David, Davies asked me something interesting today." "What's that?" "He wanted to know if you've ever had access to my jewelry box, where I keep my good pieces." David's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Why would he ask that? "Because whoever planted those contracts had to know exactly where I keep important documents. Davies says it had to be someone with intimate knowledge of our house and my habits." The word intimate hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation. "What did you tell him?" David asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I told him that only 2 people have that kind of access to our bedroom, you and me. And since I didn't plant evidence against myself." Sarah's gaze, now sharp and direct, bore into him with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. "You can't seriously think I would frame you for federal crimes," he said, allowing a tone of wounded disbelief to creep into his voice. "I don't want to think that, but David, some things haven't been adding up. The way you've been acting since this started. How calm you've been about everything. how you knew exactly which lawyer to call, and how much money to offer. David felt a familiar cold settling over him, an icy premonition. Sarah was finally asking the right questions, but she was agonizingly weeks too late. "I've been calm because one of us has to be," he said reasonably, a practiced composure in his tone. "And I knew about lawyers because I work in federal law enforcement. Who else would I call?" Sarah continued to study his face, her gaze unwavering, probing. "Davies also asked me about the timeline. When I first met Julian, when the affair started, when you might have become suspicious. And I realized that you've never actually asked me those questions. In all the weeks since my arrest, you've never asked when it started or how long it went on. Don't you think that's strange?" David started the car, giving himself a precious few seconds to think, to construct his next move. "I didn't ask because I didn't want to know the details. Sometimes ignorance is easier. Or maybe you didn't ask because you already knew." The accusation was direct now, a challenge hanging starkly between them. David could deny it, deflect, continue the elaborate charade, or he could, finally, tell the truth. He was surprised to realize he was profoundly, utterly tired of lying. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, his voice low, almost a whisper. Sarah's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. Despite her suspicions, she'd still been clinging to the desperate hope that she was wrong. "I started wondering after Davies pointed out the inconsistencies, but I wasn't sure until just now." Her voice was steady, but David could detect the faint, almost imperceptible tremor underneath. "How long have you known about the affair?" "Since the beginning. The credit card statement from Riviera Maya." "You've known for 7 months?" Sarah's voice rose slightly, a disbelieving crescendo. "You've known this entire time, and you never said anything?" "I was gathering evidence." "Evidence for what? A divorce?" "David, you could have divorced me months ago and taken half of everything. You didn't need to destroy my entire life." David pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, they sat in profound silence, both staring at their house, the home they'd shared for 16 years and would never truly share again. "You want to know why?" David asked finally, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "Because you didn't just cheat on me. You dismissed me. You and Julian and Michelle, you all talked about me like I was pathetic, like I was so weak and stupid that I'd never figure it out. David, we never. That guy couldn't find his way out of a paper bag." David's voice was flat, emotionless, quoting Julian's contemptuous words. "That's what Julian said about me. I heard him say it." Sarah went very still, her body rigid with dawning horror. "You were listening to our conversations?" "I was thorough." "My God, David, what else did you do?" David looked at her directly for the first time since they had gotten into the car. "Everything. The FBT investigation that destroyed Julian's business. Michelle's arrest for embezzlement. The evidence that made you look like Julian's business partner. All of it." Sarah stared at him in utter horror, her face contorted in disbelief. "Michelle is innocent. Michelle was skimming cash from the clinic. Just not as much as I made it look like. And the bank accounts in my name, I opened them using your information. Every transaction was designed to make you look guilty." Sarah's hand went to her throat, as if she couldn't breathe, a choked gasp escaping her lips. "You framed me for federal crimes because I had an affair? I gave you multiple chances to confess. Every time you chose to keep lying. Because I was scared, because I knew I'd made a terrible mistake, and I was trying to figure out how to fix it." David shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "You made your choice. I made mine." They sat in the driveway for several more minutes, the crushing weight of David's confession settling over them like a thick, suffocating shroud. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally, her voice fragile, barely a whisper. Now you have a decision to make. You can tell Davies the truth about what I've done, and we can both face the consequences. Or you can take the plea deal and walk away with probation. And if I expose you, then I go to prison for framing you, and you still go to trial for the affair-related charges that are actually real. Either way, your life as you knew it is irrevocably over. Sarah turned to stare at him, and David saw something in her expression that he'd never seen before. Genuine, profound fear of him. "You really hate me that much?" she whispered, her voice laced with pain. David considered the question seriously, weighing his words. "I don't hate you, Sarah. I just don't love you anymore. And I don't forgive you. So you destroyed me instead. I gave you exactly what you gave me. The only difference is that I was better at it." Sarah opened the car door and stepped out, then turned back to look at him one last time, her eyes filled with a weary understanding. "The man I married would never have done this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. David met her eyes steadily, unflinchingly. "The woman I married would never have cheated on me for 7 months while calling me pathetic behind my back." "Touché," Sarah said quietly, a grim acknowledgement, and walked into the house, closing the door softly behind her. David sat in the car for a few more minutes, watching the lights flicker on in their living room. Tomorrow, Sarah would have to decide whether to fight him or surrender to him. Either way, David had won. The next morning, David woke up alone. Sarah had spent the night in the guest room, and when he came downstairs, she was already at the kitchen table, her phone beside her, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began without preamble. David poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "And if I expose what you've done, we both go down. You're right about that. But I'm going to take the plea deal anyway." David felt a swift, sharp flash of satisfaction, a dark triumph. "That's probably the smart choice. I'm not doing it to be smart. I'm doing it because I don't want to become like you." The words hit David harder than he had expected, a surprising sting. Like me, he bristled, a defensive edge in his voice. Vindictive, calculating, willing to destroy someone completely over a personal betrayal. Sarah's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, devoid of anger or accusation, which somehow made it even more cutting. "I cheated on you, David. It was wrong, and it was hurtful, and I'm sorry. But what you've done, it's evil. I'm evil for fighting back. You're evil for enjoying it, for planning it so carefully and executing it so perfectly, for sitting back and watching me suffer while pretending to be my supportive husband." She stood up and moved toward the window, looking out at their backyard one last time, a farewell gaze. "I'm going to call Davies this morning and accept the plea deal. I'll serve my probation, pay my restitution, and then I'm leaving Beacon Hill." "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere I can start over." David studied her profile, noting the subtle shift in her posture. Straighter, somehow more resolved. "And us?" he asked, the words feeling foreign. "There is no us. You made sure of that." She turned back to face him, her eyes clear, unwavering. "I'll sign whatever divorce papers you want. Agree to whatever terms you set. You've already taken everything that matters anyway." "Sarah, no." Her voice was firm, resolute. "You don't get to feel bad about this now. You don't get to have regrets or second thoughts. You planned this for months. You executed it perfectly. You won." She started to walk out of the kitchen, then paused at the doorway, her hand on the frame. "I hope it was worth it, David. I hope destroying me was worth becoming someone you can live with." After she left, David sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the cheerful yellow walls that had once mocked him, but now seemed oddly neutral, impassive. He had expected to feel triumphant in this moment, vindicated and profoundly satisfied. Instead, he felt a crushing, pervasive emptiness. His phone buzzed with a text from Mark at work. "Hey, Mun, haven't seen you around much lately. Everything okay?" David stared at the message for a long, quiet time before typing back. "Everything's fine. Just dealing with some personal stuff." But as he sent the message, David realized, with a chilling clarity, that nothing was fine. He had spent months meticulously planning and executing the perfect revenge. And now that it was complete, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The man who had trusted his wife completely was irrevocably gone. The man who had painstakingly built this elaborate trap to destroy her was someone David barely recognized. And the man who would have to live with the profound, indelible marks of what he had done was someone he wasn't sure he wanted to be. 2 weeks later, David moved into a downtown apartment, selling the house that had held too many ghosts, too many memories of both happiness and profound betrayal. He continued working at the FBT, methodically auditing tax returns and unmasking people in their intricate financial lies. But something fundamental had shifted within him. The deep satisfaction he had once derived from uncovering deception was gone, replaced by a weary, almost melancholic recognition that everyone, in their own way, lied about something. Mar tried to maintain their friendship, but David found it increasingly difficult to truly connect with anyone. How do you explain to a casual acquaintance that you had systematically, deliberately dismantled your wife's entire life? How do you engage in mundane small talk when you intimately know the chilling extent of your own capabilities? 6 months after Sarah left Beacon Hill, David received a discreet letter from Evergreen Hills. There was no return address, but he recognized her distinctive handwriting immediately, a familiar script that stirred a forgotten echo. Inside was a brief, concise note. "I got a job managing a small accounting firm. The owner doesn't care about my record as long as I'm honest about it. Thought you should know I'm okay. S." David read the letter 3 times, each pass a quiet confirmation, then carefully filed it away in his desk drawer, a silent testament to a chapter closed. A year later, he received the official divorce papers in the mail. Sarah had kept her word. She had agreed to all his terms, without contest, without complaint. David signed them, his hand steady, and mailed them back the very same day. 2 years after Sarah's sentencing, David was promoted to senior investigator. The position came with expanded responsibility, a significantly better salary, and a prestigious corner office that offered a sweeping panoramic view of downtown Beacon Hill. David sat in that office one Tuesday afternoon, reviewing a complex case involving a small business owner named Arthur Maxwell, who had been claiming fraudulent deductions for years. It was straightforward fraud, the very kind David had expertly handled hundreds of times before, a familiar pattern of deceit. But as he meticulously read through the presented evidence, David found himself thinking, unexpectedly, about mercy, about the possibility of second chances, about the critical difference between proportional responses and raw, consuming revenge, and about the elusive line between true justice and the seductive, destructive pull of personal vendetta. He picked up his phone and called Investigator Reed. "Evelyn, it's David Albright. I wanted to ask you about the business owner we're investigating, Arthur Maxwell. Any chance this could be resolved with restitution instead of criminal charges?" "That's unusual for you, David," Evelyn replied, a note of surprise in her voice. "You usually push for maximum penalties." David looked out his window at the sprawling city below, a tapestry of lives unfolding, and thought about the man he had been and the man he had painstakingly become. "Maybe I'm getting soft in my old age," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. After hanging up, David went back to his case files. But for the first time in 2 years, he felt something that might have been peace. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was unequivocally a beginning. Outside his office window, the sun slowly set over Beacon Hill, casting long, somber shadows across the city, a quiet testament to a place where two people had once loved each other, profoundly betrayed each other, and ultimately, meticulously destroyed each other in the relentless pursuit of perfect revenge. In the end, David finally realized nobody had truly won. They had simply created different kinds of profound, lasting damage, scars that they would both have to carry forever. But perhaps eventually, they would both learn to gently lay down the crushing weight of what they had done to each other and find ways, however tentative, to move forward. David closed his case files, the papers stacked neatly, and went home to his quiet, empty apartment, where he sat in silence and tried, with a nascent, desperate hope, to remember what it truly felt like to be a man capable of both love and profound, unwavering mercy. It would take time, he knew, a long, arduous journey. But he had time now, all the time in the world, to figure out who he wanted to become next.